Hello and welcome to Rights and Recourse, a program that tackles issues affecting your rights and matters of legal recourse. My name is Dumila Matez. Remember, you can also be part of our discussion today by tweeting us at Rights Recourse or calling our studio line on 011 714 5497 or 5498. You can also SMS your views by sending the word recourse to 34025. Alternatively, email your thoughts to rightsandrecourse@sabc.co.za. Recent traumatic events during parliamentary sessions have left South Africans divided over what is parliamentary and what is not, including what rights and privileges members of Parliament enjoy. And today, Rights and Recourse takes a look at the workings of Parliament in relation to how citizens are represented by the public representatives they have elected. To unpack these issues, my guests today are Professor Tinyiko Maluleke, independent analyst attached to the University of Pretoria, will be joining us later. Professor Stephen Friedman, a director of the Centre for the Study of Democracy at the Rhodes University and at the University of Johannesburg. And in our Cape Town studio, when he arrives there, Professor Ben Turok, a former Member of Parliament. Well, if you'd like to join us today, we'll be, as I indicated, that Professor Maluleke might be joining us later. But first of all, let me put this question to you, Prof, because you are the only person here for now. The question is, when we became a republic in 1961, did we retain some of the Westminster government systems?
No, we retained all of it, in effect. Certainly Parliament functioned exactly the same way as it had before. National government functioned the same way as it had before. What happened later in the 1980s is that a presidential system was introduced. But in fact, even after the presidential system was introduced in the 1980s under the old apartheid order, the role of Parliament remained much the same as it had been before and is now.
Well, the only thing I noticed with the mace, the only thing we did, we just redid we made a new mace. We still have the mace. And what's the significance? What's the symbolism of the mace?
Well, of course, that's a valid point. I mean, if you go back in history, the mace has incredibly important symbolism in British history around about the 15th century. It was all about the powers of the monarchy and the powers of the nobility and the powers of the people. Obviously, that wasn't our queen or king, and it doesn't really affect us. So I think that the mace is really kept on because people like a bit of pomp and ceremony. It really doesn't say anything South African or African at all.
Many people I also been asking, should we have this whole parade down Adderley Street to Parliament and with the President coming slowly? Should we just have the President sitting there waiting for Parliament to start and we go on and we start Parliament?
Well, it's an interesting question because it depends on how you view your parliamentarians. I mean, probably the most remarked on president of a country in the world today is the President of Uruguay. And the reason he's remarked on is that he lives in a little flat, he drives a small car, and
he drives himself.
He drives himself, and if he was opening Parliament, he would arrive there on foot or in car to signal that he's part of the people. And maybe our politicians might want to consider that. As I say, it's a debate between signaling that you're a democratic Parliament on the one hand, and the fact that people really do like a good show on the other hand, which is, I suspect, why we have these.
Isn't this foreign system of governance not the one that is strangulating our Parliament in terms of people who want to be free, people who want to wear overalls, some people want to wear Madiba shirts, some people want to wear the African attire, and they are strangled by this Westminster system?
I think we've got to separate between what is necessary and what is not necessary. I mean, quite clearly, I think to most citizens, to anybody who looks at it rationally, the question of what people wear in Parliament is not really very interesting.
But what is important is what comes out of their mouths.
What is important is what happens in Parliament. Now, it's there that we really need to look at the rules, because it has been said in recent times in this country that the rules are no good because they restrict people. I don't think that's true. The rules are there for a reason. The rules are there for a good reason. They make sure that everybody gets a chance to speak, that the people who speak have to listen to the other side of the argument, that you respect the other point of view, and that there's an order of doing things in that way. And we will always need rules like that. Local councils have those rules. People in church committees have those rules. They're to ensure fairness. They're not colonial at all.
With respect to Professor, the question probably is, people are saying we should have sat down and re-looked at the rules. Are the rules, did we change the rules from being purely the rules that the Westminster system is using, or did we use the same rules, just move them into our parliament?
Well, to a certain extent, I mean,
or did you just do a cut and paste?
What happened in effect is that if you look at the first post-apartheid parliament, the 1994 parliament under Frenish Nwala, there was at that time a very serious attempt to say, why don't we look at these things? Why don't we free it up, make it more open, make it more relaxed, etc.? What has happened since then is that later speakers have put a whole lot of rules back in. Now, there is a legitimate debate about whether some of those rules are necessary. I mean, for example, some of them are quite trivial, standing up in various occasions. Once again, do citizens really care whether people stand up or sit down? But there is the feeling that the trend over 20 years has been to more rules rather than less rules. And there is an argument for saying that we need less rules. But I have to keep on stressing, because that's been what the debate's been around. The idea that you can't just speak when you like, that the other people have a right to speak as well, that is actually basic to any democratic committee, let alone any parliament.
I would have wanted Ben Turok to be here because he's likely to join us later, but let me ask you this question. Who sways power in the parliamentary precinct?
Well, power over what? You see, it depends. I mean, power over the rules. The Speaker and the people who work for the Speaker actually have quite a lot of power over what happens day to day in Parliament. Of course, if you're asking the bigger question of who gets to decide what is passed into law and what the government agenda is, well, that moves out of the Speaker. But the Speaker has a very important role. Now, what the Speaker is supposed to do, and I think that this is very important, is to work very closely with all the parties. There are various forums which are set up. I think a speaker who wants to retain the confidence of the parties will spend a lot of time with them, trying to make sure that everybody accepts the rules. And when that isn't done, we have problems.
The other thing I wanted to ask is pertaining to, for instance, the issues around what constitutes the precinct. Is it inside the assembly or is it outside the assembly? Or is the whole precinct of Parliament?
I think you'd have to check that with a lawyer. My understanding is that it's the whole precinct. Once you get within those gates, the rules apply, and therefore you have to observe the protocols anywhere in the premises.
Do they apply?
And certainly, if you're ejected, you can't go back to your office. You have to leave the precinct.
Do they apply even to the executive? We'll come back to the separation of powers.
Well, remember, do they
apply even to the executive?
Yes, they do apply to the executive, because remember, the executive is the cabinet. The only member of the executive who is not a member of parliament is the president, and there is a provision that you can have one or two other members who are not. But 98%, 95% of the cabinet are members of parliament, and as members of parliament, they're subject to the rules.
The other question, people have this tendency of thinking in the assembly, in the National Assembly, that is the most important part where work takes place in Parliament, and it is not. Correct. Could you explain that to us? Because work takes place in committees.
That's absolutely correct. Let's go through that process. When you say the National Assembly, I mean, people see on their television screens these politicians debating with each other and all sorts of things happening, and then they say, well, they're not really talking to each other, they're talking past each other, which is usually true. What we also have a set of portfolio committees. Each cabinet minister's portfolio has a committee of members of parliament, and it'll have a majority for the majority party, and the parties will be represented proportionally to their numbers. And then each law, even before any citizen sees it on the floor, will go to that committee and it will be thrashed out in that committee. Now, what we find in the committees, it obviously depends on the committee chair to a certain extent, but very often in the committees, they don't just ram things down people's throats. They bargain, they compromise, and they come up with something that everybody can live with. So it's a very different environment in the committees.
Well, we'll continue with our discussion on what really happens in Parliament. We are hopeful that Professor Tinyiko Maluleka will be joining us, and also down in Cape Town, Professor Ben Turok will also be joining us. If you'd like to join us in today's discussion, please call us on 011 714 5497 or 5498, or tweet us at Recourse, or email us at rightsandrecourse@sabc.co.za. Stay with us.
Zoom into Africa. This is Comoros. The president is Mr. Ikilulu Dwanine. Comoros got independent from France on 6 July in 1975. The population is over 700,000 people. One of the major languages spoken is French. Monetary unit is the Comoran franc.
Welcome back. A rather busy day here today as we are joined by Professor Tinyiko Maluleke, and down in Cape Town they will inform us whether Professor Ben Turok is ready, because I've got a couple of questions for him that I think he only can give us an extended explanation as to what is meant by the couple of things you want to ask him. Gentlemen, I want to move on to something else, the separation of power doctrine. What do we mean by separation of powers doctrine, by the separation of powers doctrine?
Who are you asking?
No, I'm asking any of you.
Well, maybe my colleague used to.
I know you actually said, the professor here said earlier, he's not a lawyer.
Well, none of us are, but as far as I understand it about the separation of powers, the idea is to ensure that each of the spheres of government is responsible for specific things in such a manner that there is no sphere of government that is responsible for everything. So, for example, you can't have the legislative also acting as the executive and also acting as the judiciary. It's a very basic principle. Of course, total separation is not possible. And separation, we've got to talk about, are we separating the staff as also? Are we separating the functions only? You know, so there's always something to talk about. But the basic idea is what I've tried to explain.
I just want to go back to Cape Town and see whether Professor Ben Turok has joined us. Professor Turok, good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Good afternoon, I'm here.
Yes, I can see. The one question I wanted to ask you, Professor, is whether the question I want to ask you is whether, Professor, one of the things we've been struggling with here is the issues of who is actually in charge of the parliamentary precinct.
The Speaker.
The Speaker in charge of
charge.
Okay, I'm
Yes.
sorry to be interrupting.
Yes. The Speaker is in charge, but she, of course, has an administration. The Secretary of Parliament, who is the administrative head and who is in charge of the facilities and the organization. But formally, the Speaker is in charge.
So anything other than the members of parliament that are on the precinct, it is the Speaker who's going to decide who comes into the precinct. The other question which we did not necessarily answer...
Yes, but before you leave that...
Yes?
Before you leave that, the Speaker can decide, but there are also rules that govern the Speaker, and there are practices which govern the Speaker, so the Speaker is not totally in command, as it were. She is formally in charge, but there are traditions and there are practices which govern the way she is in charge. And that's rather important. For example, I have with me, are you with me?
Yes, I am.
I have with me the Powers and Privileges and Immunities of Parliament Act, which lays down exactly how these things should function and what the rules are and how people should behave. So the Speaker, although she's formally in charge, she's governed by all kinds of practices and, if you like, even limitations.
I would imagine before a sitting of Parliament, the Speaker receives a report from the Whips Committee and all other committees that work around here to decide the program, and then they decide on the program, or does she decide on the program on herself?
No. There's a programming committee which decides. You see, we should not exaggerate the role of the Speaker. The Speaker has a formal function of regulating the proceedings of the House. But there are other committees which are very important, like the Programming Committee, which is also very important. And of course the Chief Whips Forum, which is also, in a way, the ultimate power. Because if the Chief Whips Forum does not decide on proceedings, then Parliament is in a stalemate.
Apparently, in accordance with Section 4 and Subsection 2 of the security services can only enter the parliamentary precinct or enter Parliament when they are summoned by the Speaker. And even then, it should only be the parliamentary security officers.
No, the rules are quite clear, and I have it in front of me, that the security services may only enter the precincts when there is a threat of some kind, and a threat to the security, or where there is a danger of some kind. I'm looking for the clause.
I think that's Section 11.
No, the Speaker can't arbitrarily decide. She's governed by the conditions of the Powers and Privileges Act. So there are very clear limitations on when the security people should come in.
Well, whilst you're checking for that,
here it is.
All right.
So here I've got it. So only the police the security services may only enter with the permission and under the authority of the Speaker when there's immediate danger to the life or safety of any person or damage to any property. Then the security services may, without obtaining such permission, enter to avert that danger. Now, question is, what does it mean, the life or safety of any person or damage to any property? And I think that the whole question of the entry of the security officers in the case of the EFF is still a little bit controversial, because was there a danger to any person, or was there a danger of damage to any property? Then the Speaker is entitled to enter and to invite the security. So, these are still matters which are subject to interpretation.
I will come back to that, Prof. I just want to come back to my professors here in Johannesburg. Gentlemen, this thing that with this word we've always heard about, the decorum of the house. What do we mean by a decorum of the house? When I grew up, the decorum to me was clothing, how I dress neatly. But I'm told there's a decorum of the house. You've got to refer to Professor Friedman, the Honorable Professor Friedman.
Yeah, well, that is one example.
Appropriately.
That's one example. You're supposed to call other members the honourable member. Look, the whole idea behind decorum is the idea that people ought to respect their members of parliament, and people will not respect them. This is all in theory. This is not necessarily what happens in practice. In theory, people will not respect their members of parliament if the members of parliament do not behave in a dignified way. So decorum, in that sense, means you don't shout when the other person is talking, or you don't try to use fisticuffs to get your way. You show respect to your opponent. You behave in a dignified way. Now, for some reason, they always stick to the honourable bit. I haven't heard any of them try to get around that, except perhaps for the leader of the parliamentary opposition in something he said the other day. But they tend to very often, when things get heated, ignore the rest. But the theory is that they should behave in this very dignified fashion.
We heard Professor Ben Turok, Professor Tinyeko Maluleke, talking about if the police or the security forces or the security of Parliament, let me put it that way, can only enter Parliament if there is a danger to a member of Parliament. We all remember the events of September the 6th, 1966. Nobody could have imagined that that was going to happen when Dimitrios Tsafendas said to have stabbed the former Prime Minister Hendrik Verwoerd to death inside the National Assembly.
Well, even that danger, I think, was probably not foreseen. And so it becomes quite difficult to predetermine danger inside Parliament. And I think the question is, was there danger of such a nature on the 12th of February this year that you needed the police to come in? And of course, there's also the question of which police can come in. I think that the DA is taking the matter to court because especially that Section 11, because of precisely that. So it doesn't seem that on that day there was danger. I mean, but you could argue that when Tsafendas was there, it didn't seem that there was danger on that day either.
Professor, on that Tsafendas issue, Professor Turok, on the Tsafendas issue, I would imagine that all members of Parliament and all people who work in the precincts are vetted.
Yes, they are vetted, and you also sign an oath. But let me say that I went into the House of Commons once in London, into the visitors' gallery, and I had a little parcel with me, and they took the parcel away. So that the security people are very sensitive about assassination. Because in the Tsafendas case, I don't think anything could have been done about that. Because that official wasn't searched, our officials are not searched. And if one of our officials carried a gun or a knife, they would get away with it and they would be able to assassinate. There's no way you can prevent that. Even in the case of Madiba or Mbeki or Zuma, when they leave the chamber, they walk down corridors adjacent to the house. And while there are security men standing around, if somebody was determined to assassinate a head of state or anybody else, I think would be very difficult to stop it. But we're talking about something else, namely group behavior. And that, of course, is much more easily controlled. And of course, the degree to which you exercise the control is subjective. I think that, and I would like to say quite frankly, when the EFF first began to make a noise in the House, there was a lot of sympathy for them around the country. The media were quite sympathetic, and there was a feeling that let these youngsters voice their feelings and their protests, because it seemed quite innocuous, and it seemed as if it was in the spirit of making the House more lively. And frankly, I think the House does need to be made more lively. Things are really very often very dull. And the speeches are read. You're not supposed to read a speech, according to the rules. But nearly everybody does. I must say, I myself, over 20 years, never read a speech. I had notes, but I never read a speech. But I'm afraid you can't say that for many colleagues who read speeches. It becomes very boring. And so when the EFF started their activities, it looked as though they were trying to liven up the proceedings. But as things
Professor,
went
we'll come
on,
back to that.
became more serious.
Professor, unfortunately, we have to go back to a break. I'll come to you. We'll continue our discussions here. I just want to bring in the two other professors when we come back. We'll explore further the issue of the doctrine of separation of powers when we come back. You can also call us on 714-5497 or 5498 or tweet us at Rise Recourse. Stay with us.
Ja, de paar keer zeggen. Kom.
Welcome back. We are still continuing discussing the issues around how Parliament functions, and now we want to stick and deal with the issue of separation of powers. Gentlemen, we have seen one of the biggest concern by several parties is in fact that they seek to emphasize from time to time that is the ministerial accountability and responsibility to Parliament as set out in Section 92 of the Constitution. And many parties seem to be very frustrated by the fact that many ministers don't even come to Parliament to respond to questions.
Well, that's a very real problem. I mean, that's not a separation of powers issue. That's an accountability issue. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, you know, except for the President and at most a couple of ministers, I mean, these are all members of Parliament. Even if they're not members of Parliament, they're accountable to Parliament. Because remember that in our system, although the President is not a member of Parliament, Parliament can remove the President. So in that sense, whoever is president is accountable to Parliament. Well, if you're accountable to people, you need to explain to them what you're doing. And of course, the other point about this is that far more important, I think, for most South Africans is if you don't account to Parliament, then you're not accounting to the people. Then the people don't know what you're doing, and the people can't form a judgment of what you do. So that accountability issue is a very important question. I mean, people very often throw in the separation of powers issue when they don't want one branch of government to trample on another. And there is, you know, you don't want politicians telling judges what to do. That's a very sound principle. On the other hand, you tend to find that the same people who complain about separation of powers when they want independence are very keen to abolish separation of powers when they want to tell a particular arm of government what to do.
In respect of that very issue the Professor is raising, Professor Maluleke, we have seen parties calling for adjudication by the courts, and many people have actually accused them of either involving courts in matters that should be resolved by Parliament.
Yeah, I think what Steve is saying is very important. I think the issue of accountability should not be conflated with the question of separation of powers, because it seems to me it becomes convenient. People throw in the separation of power issue in order to avoid issues of accountability to Parliament. Of course, it would be desirable that Parliament is able to resolve all issues and conflicts inside of itself, using its committee system, using the powers of the speakers, using the chief whips forums, and all those. But it does happen that even those, as we have seen, are unable to resolve their own issues, and they have had to go to the judiciary. It is not the worst thing that could happen, in my view, to go to the courts. But clearly it's not the most desirable thing for them to be going in and out of courts for things that they could have resolved inside of Parliament.
Professor Turok, what is your understanding of the separation of powers doctrine with regard to Parliament?
Well, it's a very important doctrine, but there are no iron gates between the three spheres. There are overlaps, and there are often boundary disputes, if I may put it that way. For example, it is said that the executive is responsible for policy, but Parliament passes laws, and you can't pass laws without examining policy. So sometimes in Parliament, as a minister reports and lays down policy, the Portfolio Committee will say, well, we find that particular policy difficult to implement, and the law has certain contradictions. So the separation of powers is a very important principle, because otherwise you have one sphere of government, and that is really an authoritarian state, which we don't want and the Constitution doesn't allow. But at the margins, it is often very difficult to draw the line. For example, we know that the Constitutional Court is often unwilling to deal with political matters. They want to deal with legislative matters, with judicial matters, but not political matters, and therefore adopt a kind of arm's length approach when appeals are made to the Constitutional Court to adjudicate on, if you like, administrative matters. So, you know, the lines are a little bit blurred, even though the principle is terribly important.
Gentlemen, I wanted to get that explanation from a former member of Parliament in Professor Turok. But what I have noticed is we have seen the executive being tempted to use extraordinary powers to rein in the opposition in the events of the last 6 months. They were very frustrated with the events of the last 6 months.
Well, it depends what you're talking about. I mean, I partially agree with you. In the sense that I think that there has been a heavy hand. I mean, if you looked at the famous events or the infamous events of the night of the State of the Nation address, I mean, you've asked, a member has challenged you, you've then said, this is my ruling, which is fine. I mean, surely what happens then, you then say, are you prepared to accept my ruling, or you simply carry on? If you look at the tapes, what happened in that case, the speaker said, well, I'm asking you to leave. When those sorts of things happen, there is a problem. If we're going to be very specific about the situation right now, I've mentioned several times that I think that there is a problem when the Speaker of Parliament is also the chairperson of the governing party, because you're wearing two hats, and I'm not sure how you, decide which is more important on any given day, and I think that's led to part of the problems. On the other hand, I think we mustn't throw the baby out of the bathwater. A lot of what we've been hearing in the last few months implies that everybody's becoming heavy-handed if you tell a member of Parliament that they can't call somebody else a liar and they can't swear at their opponents. And those rules are there for a reason. They're there not because we're stuffy and British, they're there because that's how people debate with each other. You don't hurl abuse at your opponent. So it once again becomes a question of distinguishing between what we need to have a democratic parliament and what is simply people throwing their weight around.
Professor Turok, to what extent did we come close to straddling this doctrine during with the events of the last 6 months in Parliament?
You mean the doctrine of separation of powers?
The doctrine of separation of powers.
I think we've been close to the margin for some time. And I think that, to be real, there's an African National Congress, which is the ruling party. It has a Lekgotla, its national executive sits down and decides on policy. The ministers are at that meeting. From that meeting, it goes to the views go to cabinet. Cabinet then sits in a Lekgotla, where the same issues are brought up and discussed. And really, the ruling party is also in the cabinet. Now, when they sit as a cabinet, obviously, the decisions are governed by the requirements of state. For example, the budget is an independent statement of the national executive of the ANC. But it's absolutely influenced by what the NEC had to say. It must be. If the Minister of Finance departs totally from what the ANC says as a political party, he will be in trouble because he is departing from the general broad mandate. And even if he tailors his budget in order to meet the requirements of the fiscus in, let's say, a responsible way, he can never forget. And even in the House, when the budget is debated, and this is again where the separation of powers issue comes up, when the Minister of Finance presents his budget and it is debated in the House, the majority is the ANC, and they will obviously take a position in the light of the party position on all sorts of matters. So, these things are not cut and dry.
They're not cut and dry.
And there are overlaps and there are influences both ways.
I like the terms. There are no iron gates between these powers. Professor Tinyiko, we have come to understand, I have come to understand that the Constitutional Court is there to straighten up whatever legislation is there. In other words, we have seen the Constitutional Court adjudicating on legislation that is incongruent with the Constitution and instructing Parliament to rectify such legislation. Should we be happy we have a Constitutional Court that can do that, despite the fact that we have these gates between these three spheres of government?
I think so. I mean, I think it's very... Look, we must always remember, in my view, why you have the separation of powers, whether it is the separation between the three spheres plus the party, as Professor Benturok is emphasizing, because I think it's an important point, because the party is also another animal in the configuration that needs to be taken into account.
Some would call it an elephant.
The elephant in the room.
You see, the reason for the separation is to prevent one entity doing everything by itself. That's a very important reason.
That was what Montesquieu wanted us to believe.
Precisely, precisely. You know, so I think the Constitutional Court then has a very important place. The judiciary in general has a very important role to play. I hear about the boundary issues, but I mean, if I look at what happened on the 12th of February, the question, and if you look at the insect matter, if I may use
the insect matter,
yeah, the insect matter. You see, it would have never occurred for a Speaker of Parliament to be at a party Congress and having to address, to wear a different hat. That temptation to talk about the insects would not have been there for a Speaker of Parliament if the Speaker of Parliament was not also the chairperson of the political party.
Let me go back to Professor Turok on that point. Professor Turok, did the ANC, the ruling party here, shoot itself in the foot by nominating Ms. Maleka Mbete for Speaker of Parliament even though she is the chairman of the party? She will be expected to address.
I agree. I think that's a mistake. And you see, she's been a speaker before, and I was in the House when she was a speaker, and she did try to be fair, more or less, to both sides, a bit objective. But in the heat of the present situation, and don't forget this is actually an abnormal situation. It's no longer a normal parliament because of the way the EFF is behaving. So in this abnormal environment, with all the noise and disruption, it is very difficult for the Speaker to be impartial and arm's length. And so the party element gets in the way. And I think, frankly, I agree with the other two speakers that it's unfortunate.
Well, yes, we are going to continue our discussion here on rights and recourse on the issues that are taking place in Parliament. What should you expect our Parliament to do? If you'd like to join us on today's discussion, please do call us on 011 714 5497 or 5498 or tweet us at rights and recourse. Don't go away. We'll be back right after this.
Hello and welcome to Your World on SABC News Channel 404. I'm Tabile Ngwato.
And I'm Lulu Gabu.
President Uhuru Kenyatta says he will attend the status conference for his crimes against humanity case, but in his personal capacity and not as president of Kenya.
Judges insist he attends this status conference.
About 50 Kenyan MPs are expected to travel to The Hague to express solidarity with President Kenyatta.
The Kenya cases have really tested the International Criminal Court in ways that it hasn't yet been tested.
Your World, weekdays at 9 p.m.
Welcome back to Rights and Recourse. Before we proceed, I wanted to push some more questions around the issue of separation of powers, but let's take this call from Kaya from Midrand. Kaya, good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse. Hello, Kaya, are you there? Hello. Kaya, are you there? Is Kaya still there?
Hello. Very faintly.
Well, I can't hear Kaya now. Kaya, there you are. Are you there? Hello, Kaya.
Hello.
Are you there?
Hi, this is Kaya.
What's your question? Now, Kaya, while Kaya is breaking up there, gentlemen, I want to go back to a question I asked before we came on air. Professor Turok in Cape Town, probably I should start with you. I'll get the views this side after I have spoken to you. In America and France, this issue of separation of power is dealt with very well. Members of cabinet are not necessarily members of the Congress. They are not members of the Congress at all, even in France. Should we have such a situation where when a member is appointed as a cabinet cabinet member, that member is then comes to a committee for confirmation. Should we do what the Americans are doing?
Well, I don't know. You know, each country has its own traditions. You know, in the last parliament, we had Praveen Gordhan as a Minister of Finance, who was not a member of parliament. He was not an elected member of parliament. So he was appointed, you remember he was in SARS, and from SARS he moved to be Minister of Finance. So, you know, there is a bit of mix and match in our system, and there are ways that the President can appoint, I think it is 2 members of the Cabinet, or maybe 3, who are not elected members of Parliament. But we have chosen a particular system, and I think we could make it work if the other circumstances worked better. You know, we have a very turbulent situation politically now for a whole lot of reasons that you have mentioned. The problem isn't so much with the rules of how people are appointed or elected. It's far more a matter of what attitude people take to the job and to the institution. My problem is that the attitude of members of the executive, and maybe even the President, to the institution is creating a bit of tension, because the attitude isn't one of cooperation very often. It's far more antagonism, hostility. You see, you were talking earlier about decorum. You know, decorum includes many things, and it is quite reasonable for a member to shout across the House, to raise a question across the House. Trevor Manuel was very fond of that. He would interrupt a Speaker of the Opposition and yell and say, "What do you mean by that?" And that was perfectly okay.
Yes.
It wasn't in the rules, but it was acceptable because it was in a proper spirit of if you like,
it should be banter from time to time.
Teasing. Yes.
Let me come back to...
You know, it's a...
Carry on, Prof. You were saying something?
No. So it's a matter of attitude. If people come to Parliament with a hostile attitude, with the intent of disruption, or with hostility, then no matter what the rules are, they will find ways of doing something which is unpleasant and wrong.
We'll come back to issues of discipline to members of Parliament who overstep the line in Parliament. But I want to first get my professors here in Johannesburg, your views on what I said earlier regarding the American system and the French system.
Yeah, look, I don't know that it adds a whole lot more value to have cabinet ministers endorsed. It would just become another forum for further debate. Of course, you do want to find ways in which the executive is co-owned by Parliament and the presidency, if you like, because that would be the point. But I don't know that it would change much. The power of the president to appoint cabinet ministers, you know, do you want to limit that? And if you were to do that, what are the advantages of doing that? Would it really change anything, given the power of the party? I mean, which is what Professor Turok was talking about earlier, that the party is very powerful, both in giving cues for policy framework, but also in giving job descriptions for ministers in terms of the lines within which they have to operate. So I don't know that such a tinkering with the appointment system would necessarily change the fundamentals.
I think it's more serious than that, because I think what is not being taken into account, if you go that route, you are moving to a strictly presidential system. And a strictly presidential system is one in which the president, for example, can never be removed by Parliament. I assure you, for better or for worse, if in America the Parliament could remove the president, they would have done it just after the last election.
They struggled to do that with President Clinton.
So the point is that it concentrates a lot of power in the hands of the president. The president's cabinet, the reason the president's cabinet is not responsible to the Congress is because, in fact, the president's cabinet is a glorified bunch of civil servants, okay? Yeah. Because essentially they are there because they are there to do the president's bidding. In our system, both the president and the cabinet, including those members, Professor Chirok mentioned, who are not members, are responsible because Parliament can chuck them out. And remember that in our system, if Parliament really dislikes a minister and the way the minister is behaving, they could refuse to pass that minister's budget vote, in which stage that minister can't operate and that minister would have to be replaced. So in our system, Parliament actually does have the power to make changes in the cabinet if it really
Thank you for
wanted.
that, Prof. Let's take this call from Kaya. Kaya, good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse. Well, we don't seem to have Kaya. Kaya, are you there? Well, I don't see Kaya. I don't hear Kaya. Prof. Turok, let me go back to you. Well, Kaya, are you there? Prof, let me go back to you. Prof, the question is, what I'm trying to say, what sort of disciplinary measures are there in Parliament to rein in members who do the kind of things you say? They go to Parliament to do exactly what they want to disrupt. They will disrupt. What are the disciplinary measures Parliament has to rein in those members? Earlier you were looking through an act of Parliament, that is the Privileges and something Act.
Yes, well, there is a Powers and Privileges Committee which can engage in disciplinary action for contempt of Parliament. And in fact, that disciplinary committee did meet recently, and they sat, and it's multi-party, by the way, and they consider disciplinary action against members of Parliament for whatever purpose, for whatever reason. Of course, here again, the ANC has a majority, and the ANC can decide against the opposition on what is disciplinary and what is not. You know, we do have rules. I do want to emphasize that we do have rules. And there is the Powers and Privileges Act, which lays down quite important provisions. But in a way, rules in Parliament is not a court of law. So, you know, you don't have contempt of Parliament in the same way
As
that
you
you
would
have
have
contempt of court, where the judge says that is in contempt of court.
Prof, we'll come back. We'll come back to this issue. We'll come back to this
Right.
issue. I just need to go to a
Right.
break. I was supposed to go to a break earlier. If you'd like to join us on today's discussion, please call us on 714-5497 or 5498 at Rights, or tweet us at Rights Recourse, or email us at rightsandrecourse@sabc.co.za. Stay with us.
In Africa, mobile devices are tools to make payments, browse the internet, and keep governments in check with social media forums.
It's given an average African too much power in their hands.
And tech creativity is solving some of the continent's problems.
Everything is internet driven.
And on Network, we tell you how Africans are using technology and social media in their everyday lives.
Join Siphumelele Zondi on Network every Sunday at 19:30 CAT.
Hello, Singo. Good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Hello, how are you?
Fine, thanks. How are you?
Hello?
What is your question?
I'm all right with you.
What is your question?
Yeah, I just want to ask if is it possible that the speaker must not be coming from the ruling party?
Well, yeah, that's a very nice question. Probably let me put that question to these gentlemen here next to me. Is it possible that the speaker should not come from the ruling party?
In theory, it's possible because in some systems they do allow an opposition MP, but that depends on the governing party. The governing party has the majority. Parliament chooses a speaker, and as long as the governing party wants one of its own there, then that will happen.
Let's put that question to Professor Turok. Professor Turok in Cape Town, can it happen that the Speaker should not come from the ruling party?
It has happened in the House of Commons, where a member of the opposition was the Speaker, and in theory it could happen in South Africa. But given the relations these days in South Africa, it's very unlikely that the ANC would surrender that power, because it is a powerful position.
I want to go back to the issue of the committee you spoke about earlier. You sat on the Ethics Committee, and you wrote in your submission to Parliament on the Honourable former Minister Diana Poole's case, we have to be objective in complying with the joint rules of Parliament. We cannot be politically partisan. We cannot allow bias or prejudice to enter into our considerations. We must base our judgments on facts, and where there is a conflict on the facts, we have to discover the truth. I think that committee, what I wanted to say, the committee should be partisan, as you say in your report. Should not be partisan, yes.
Yes. No, the Ethics Committee was a special committee because it had has punitive powers, and in that case we were dealing with a senior member of the ruling party and a minister, and we had to be sure of our grounds. And the problem was that she lied throughout the hearings, which I chaired. I was chair of the hearings, and she lied all the time. So it was very, very important that we should act with a total consensus, and let me say that only on one minor occasion did that committee function without unanimity. We were unanimous across party lines. And that's because we were very tolerant, we went very carefully about all procedures, and we were determined to speak with one voice across all parties, and we did so.
Thank you, Professor.
If I may draw your
Yes, go ahead,
I want
Professor.
to draw your attention. I want to draw your attention to a clause in this same act that I was dealing with, which is about discipline. And I wasn't quite correct when I said Parliament is not a court of law. There is a clause which says a member is guilty of contempt of Parliament if he or she willfully fails or refuses to obey any rule, order, or resolution of a House. An order of a House, not of the Speaker. So you see, the way the thing works is if any member commits an act of contempt in whatever way, then it is a rule of the House which constitutes contempt, and if they commit contempt, then that is a breach or abuse of parliamentary privilege. So you see, there is a clause dealing with contempt, and it's not the Speaker. The Speaker acts on behalf of the House. But when the House is divided, then you have a bit of a problem. But there is provision for discipline.
Thank you very much. Let me come back to my professors here in the studio. Earlier, we spoke about the non-partisan, forget the fact that I said partisan, non-partisan of the party. But first, I'll come back to it. Let me take this call from somebody who's on the line. Good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse. Hello, good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Good afternoon.
Yes, sir. What's your question?
How are you?
Fine, thanks. How are you, Pat? What is your question?
Yes, hello, hello, sir. Yes, it's Pat Kumalo from Ekurhuleni.
What is your question? Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. Yes. In actual fact, sir, I think I was listening to Professor Turok. I think he was correct talking about attitude. Look, what happened, the media went out to say the EFF is going to disrupt. And when the EFF made the parliament aware that they want to ask a question, and the media went around and until everybody said, was convinced that the EFF was going to interrupt. And I wanted to know, is that an interruption? Because that's what the analyst needed to answer. Was that an interruption when an EFF wanted to know, one, whether which rule is actually applied for them not to ask any question there? We were sitting listening, wanted to know. You just wanted to know was that a disruption? Because when you talk about attitude, I think the speaker had an attitude. It has nothing to do with the political affiliation and whatever, but the speaker had an attitude. So I wanted to know that when are we going to discuss whether the rules was followed and the EFF was on the rule and it was correct, whether the EFF should ask that rule now. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Pat. Professor, let me go back to you in Cape Town before I come to my other two professors here. The question is directed to you. The question is the issue of attitude you spoke about earlier. Obviously, I was also a little bit confused with the sitting on that day where members of parliament stood up and said, we want, it's a question of privilege. That's what we want. What's the meaning between a question of privilege and wanting a ruling or whatever?
You know, there are certain traditions which have been long-standing. You cannot stand up in the House and speak without the permission of the Speaker. The Speaker must ask you to speak. And if the Speaker does not ask you to speak, you're not allowed to speak. And if you continue to speak without the Speaker's permission, you are breaching the rules of Parliament and the traditions of Parliament. And what happened on that occasion is many members, including DA and others, got up and started shouting and asking questions and so on, which meant that the House was in disorder. I have some sympathy for the Speaker because the situation became intolerable. Normally, if you want to ask a question, you will stand up and you will say, point of order, or may I ask a question? You first say, point of order. Then the Speaker will say, okay, I call on you to raise your point of order. But if the Speaker does not call upon you to raise your point of order, you have to sit down.
Professor, thank you very much. I think we've heard you. Quickly, 1 second from you, Professor Maluleke. We've run out of time.
Yeah, I'm not so sure, you know, the more I think about this, whether these are issues of just issues of rules. I think that people have lost respect of one another inside that House. And the political lines have become hardened, and the Speaker doesn't seem to wield any authority whatsoever in the minds of the members of the House. And I think those are the things that must be addressed.
I agree with Professor Maluleke. It's about whether you believe
Let's leave it at that. Probably we should
do you believe in democratic debate or not?
Well, we seem not to be understanding each other. This has been Right and Recourse. This program is repeated at 10 tonight and 5 on Monday morning. From all of us in the studio, thank you to our guests and good afternoon.
In Africa, mobile devices are tools to make payments, browse the internet, and keep governments in check with social media forums.
It's given an average African too much power in their hands.
And tech creativity is solving some of the continent's problems.
Everything is internet driven.
And on Network, we tell you how Africans are using technology and social media in their everyday lives.
Join Siphumelele Zondi on Network every Sunday at 19:30 CAT.
Cameroon's economic capital, a unique art collection is on display. Titled Yesterday's Memory, Tomorrow's Memory.
We are trying to preserve this heritage despite many things that have changed in the designing, embroidery and the model.
If I'm telling you, you don't like it, I call it defeat.
Join Musam Khalipi on Afro Showbiz every Saturday at 19:30 CAT.
It's now exactly 1500 hours Central African time. A good afternoon, and if you're just joining us, a warm welcome to this, your Sunday edition of PM News, live from Johannesburg with me, Obriel Mpofu, and joining me from the sports desk, Marumo Kekana. Good afternoon, Marumo.
Good afternoon, Obriel.
I see Zimbabwe now have been beaten by Pakistan at the Cricket World Cup, eh?
By just 20 runs. I mean, what a dramatic game that was. Look, at some point it looked like Zimbabwe had it covered. I mean, with one of their players, Brendan Taylor, putting a 50 on the mark. So I thought with 50 on the, I mean, they were just chasing 230 couple of runs. So it looked like an easy one, but hey, what do you know? This is a game of cricket. And again, Pakistan, they are the former champions themselves. So they have a bit of depth that it was coming with them. But of course, on the other sporting stories that will be also covering for you, there's a match between the Bloemfontein Celtics and the Tycoons from the North. That's a Platinum Stars. That game will be happening at the Free State Stadium in Bloemfontein. Stick with us. Later on, we have this and other stories making headlines in the world of sports.
Well, there you have it. So much to look forward to then in your sports news. Right now, though, a look at the other stories also making the headlines this hour. President Jacob Zuma addresses the official ceremony of the repatriated remains of struggle stalwarts Moses Kotane and JB Max at the Waterkloof Air Force Base in Pretoria. Vote counting underway in Lesotho following a snap election aimed at resolving the political crisis triggered by a botched coup attempt. And also ahead in your sports, Pakistan has won its first match of the Cricket World Cup, defeating Zimbabwe by 20 runs at the Gabba on Sunday. And into our top story now, President Jacob Zuma says Moses Kotane and JB Max were responsible for shaping many of South Africa's revolutionary leaders. Speaking at the Waterkloof Air Force Base in Pretoria, where the remains of the two struggle icons arrived this morning from Russia, Zuma said it was a sad but also a joyous occasion.
These two giants indeed played a critical and fundamental role in our struggle. They shaped the political thinking of many cadres and the leaders of our struggle in their lines, be in the ANC, be in the South African Communist Party, be in the trade union movement.